on its side. Towards the back of the composition wandered a figure in a spacesuit. Ja Aili spoke matter-of-factly of the monumental changes that had taken place in his lifetime and which lay behind this painting. He told me he was interested in exploring the secrets behind modern history and its endless implications, a history whose objective reality was often hard to grasp. Everyone knows what's happened in China and the whole world in the 30 years since I was born. I'm simply a northerner. I've experienced the 4 seasons, the germinating of my body and my mind, and the loss of faith. Elsewhere in Beijing in the spring of 2009, Anwar was reconnecting with an experience that years before had changed his life, an experience which had intensified his senses of the immensity of nature, something that made him determined to create work that embodied its force. In 1987, he had spent 100 days exploring the Taklamakan Desert, which lies at the heart of Xinjiang. The Taklamakan is studded with ancient cities lost beneath its dunes, and its shifting sands have a well-earned reputation for treachery. But it exercised a powerful attraction to Anwar, who had been born on its fringes. In the summer holidays that year, his fellow students had been encouraged to go out and explore their country in preparation for their final year at college. Most of them had headed for the special economic zones, but Anwar had decided to return to his homeland. Over a number of weeks, armed with a sketchpad, compass, dried food, and 3 canteens of water, he made 2 or 3 day sorties into the Taklamakan and out again. His idea was simple: to feel the desert, to walk alone. But then on a journey to a place called Black Sand Mountain, he lost his way. He'd been told that when he reached the mountain, he would be able to see his way back from its summit, but when he arrived, all he could see was sand. Faced with endless dunes, he began to doubt his compass and finally chose a direction and stuck to it out of sheer desperation. Unable to sleep for fear the sand would swallow him up, he hiked for 5 days, battling panic and thirst, forcing himself not to drink his last canteen of water. Finally, he saw a group of trees on the horizon. In the Taklamakan, where there are trees, there are people. He felt a flood of relief mixed with fear that his senses were playing tricks. It was only when he smelt the sap on the air that he knew he was safe. Years later, he could still remember the rough sensation of the bark against his skin as he embraced it to make sure the trees weren't a mirage. I was transformed by that experience, Anwar told me, and I found new hope. After I'd been through all that confusion and found my way again, I understood more about the true relationship between life and art. I knew what real art is, and I knew I could only make art. He wasn't interested in the material, the political, or the pop. He wanted to explore realms of artistic expression where words have no place. Over a decade since the late 1990s, he had developed his own abstract language of painting. The vivid colors and their layering on the canvas, often over months, stroke by considered stroke, gave his work a mirage-like illusion of depth and space, which Anwar thought as their force field. Since his experience in the desert, he had wanted to find a way to engage nature directly in his work, and in 2008, he had finally found one. That spring, he had moved into a new studio with a courtyard, just as he was starting to work with water-soluble oil paints. His idea was to give the physical and the sensual phenomenon of weather and the seasons a role in his creative process. He took canvases he had worked on for many months in the studio and placed them face up in the open yard. There, he dripped pigment from above, letting the breeze scatter and drag it across their surfaces. Then he waited for one of Beijing's famous spring or summer storms to break, allowing the first drops of rain to fall onto the canvases and pool, resulting in an opalescent quality. When all the elements cooperated, the pieces were finished in a single afternoon. Others were painted by the wind in January and completed by a rain shower in April. When I visited him in the late spring of 2009, he'd been using this unique version of plein air painting for more than a year. The canvases set up around his studio suggested not just of wind and rain, but of stars swirling in space. But the day I arrived, he wasn't painting on canvas. Instead, he was working with hundreds of felt mats, rolling them one by one into tubes, which he then adorned with a single stroke of blue paint. He'd been asked to participate in a group exhibition about sound and music, and faced with the prospect of contributing still more noise, he decided instead to offer silence. The rolled mats, made out of a kind of woolen felt that in Xinjiang adored nomads' houses, were going to line a room in the exhibition venue. Tightly placed side by side, the mats would cover the 4 walls and the roof, until the room was perfectly insulated by the soft wool. He remembered how it had been years before, when he had been studying for his university entrance exams, and he had to cocoon himself away in the wool dyeing room to read. There he remembered it had been so quiet that he believed he could hear the sound of his blood pushing through his body. "The absence of sound will help you to really hear," he told me. "You will hear what's inside your body, not outside. You will hear your own body living." I smiled quietly at Anwar's idea, but I still went to the exhibition. It was called Music to My Eyes, and it sprawled out over multiple floors of a new private museum in the capital's CBD. Searching for Anwar's felted room, I came upon a strange darkened box tucked away in a far corner of the show. Inside the box on a screen, I saw a video of a girl. To a soundtrack she'd remixed of a Chinese punk rock hit, she was working her way along a whitewashed wall, painting, then erasing, then painting again, changing her clothes from a slick gangster-like suit to a white wedding dress to a bikini and a platinum wig, stripping naked in between, then painting again. From time to time, she would pick up a can and spray paint the question, "Isn't something missing?" She painted a headless man in a suit, a graffitied hokusai octopus ravishing a naked woman, a fleshy-lipped man in close-up reclining on his side, as if viewed from a neighboring pillow. And then she spray-painted across his face, blacking out his eyes and tagging, "Miss you, miss you." Finally, she returned to the wall to its whitewashed state, leaving behind a scroll LED sign which kept on asking, "Isn't something missing?" over and over again. The work was exhilaratingly angry and exhausting, with its cycle of creation and destruction played out to a screeching soundtrack. I loved it. "I want the audience to feel pain too," the artist told me when I met her later, "because everyone is missing something." Her name was Pei Li. She was 24 years old and disarmingly fresh-faced when I met her, despite the cauldron of emotions brewing inside her. Her video had been inspired by a failed love affair, one that had left her in the hospital after she drank so much vodka in her despair that her stomach had begun to bleed. "I like the taste of it," she told me, not specifying if she meant the vodka or the blood. She came from a generation born in the 1980s, children of the one-child policy, the generation that older Chinese kept saying had no depth or insight. Cao Fei once described them to me as the Instagram generation. "They don't look at anything for long," she said. "For them, it's all snapshots." But Pei Li wasn't like that at all. She looked at everything with intensity, and in doing so, she made me look at China in a new way. What she reminded me most of were the poets I had once drunk with under the stars at the old summer palace. She told me she wasn't even sure she wanted to be an artist. Maybe she just wanted to be a punk. Later she would tell me about her traditional upbringing in Changzhou, in the heart of what I always thought was as willow pattern plate China, deep in the Yangtze Delta, a country of classical gardens and jasmine tea, of arching stone bridges and silk embroidery, of poets and pagodas. She had gone to art school in Hangzhou, famous for its West Lake, which had been celebrated by poets and painters over centuries, and which was now home to China's version of Silicon Valley. She'd studied new media and video there, and Isn't Something Missing had been her graduation work. They hadn't thought much of it, she told me. I wasn't a very good student. I'm often angry. If you have strong emotions, it's better to create than destroy, isn't it? She asked and didn't wait for an answer. I think in everyone's deepest heart, there's a violent side, and I want to use that violent side to create. 20 long years of living separated her from the artists who had come of age at Tiananmen Square. But it was as if she had drunk from the very same source they had done in the late 1980s, when hope was new. I thought of what Pei Li had said about her anger when I went to Shenqi's exhibition just a few weeks later. It was June and the 20th anniversary of Tiananmen had just passed. Shenqi had started experimenting with painting in 2002, and for a long time he'd struggled for a style that would capture the mood of sadness he wanted to convey. His first efforts, he told me, were too romantic, too beautiful, too much on the surface, and he kept looking for something more spicy, more harsh. Finally, he found a dripping technique with paint, which gave his canvases the impression that rain, or tears, were running down them in rivulets. He chose to work predominantly in red and black, colors that to his eyes embodied bravery. If you have enough courage to stand up, you will be heard, he told me. If I chose black and white, that would be weak, but black and red shows courage. To stand up is to be bloody. Now he had completed a body of paintings that he would show in June 2009, 20 years after, and in honor of the events that had changed his life. It was only a day or two since his show had opened, but it looked as if the place had been ransacked. Many of the walls were blank except for the labels showing where the missing works had been. Shinchi wearily told me how it had gone down. On the day of the opening, the police had arrived promptly to take down works that offended them. First among these was a painting of a smiling policewoman in full dress uniform and holding up a 100 RMB note as if it was her police badge. They thought I was implying there was a connection between power and money, and they didn't like it, he told me. Then he added, I was saying that, of course. Their objection to a second group of paintings was more overtly political. These were paintings that featured Chairman Mao. In one, a giant statue loomed over a prostrate crowd. In another, a bust of Mao stood on a square filled with tiny people. Rendered in red, the chairman's head dripped across the black and white figures. But the paintings that they had let remain still told the bloody story Shinchi wanted to convey. One showed crowds of young people seated in Tiananmen Square, their figures black and white, the square washed with red. Another showed a young woman lying as if sleeping, the paint weeping across her body. Yet another depicted crowds sheltering under umbrellas, as if shielding themselves from grief. A few days after my visit, the police shut down the whole exhibition. They also arrived at Shinchi's studio to give him a warning. It was polite enough, but the message was clear. After a decade of trying, he knew he had to leave China once more. I thought, I don't have any famous family to protect me from trouble. I am a son of nobody, so I have to go. In 2010, 12 years after he had returned home to China, he flew out again for London. Days after I saw Shinchi's truncated exhibition, I took a walk through 798, wondering whether anyone else had dared to show work about Tiananmen. There I found a gallery that had built a steel-reinforced room with a porthole through which you could view the show. Inside the room, a fire hose set to full blast kicked and arched, spraying water at the glass. The power of the water was extraordinary, and despite the steel rivets, a little of it still escaped to wet your face as you peered in. The title of the show was Freedom. And then in December, Liu Shaobo was finally brought to trial. He had been charged with incitement of subversion of state of power. There was no doubt that he would be found guilty. At the trial, he tried to read a statement, but the presiding judge cut him off after 14 minutes, ruling that his statement in defense could not be longer than the statement by the prosecutor. 14 minutes was all the time it had taken to argue that he should be imprisoned. June 1989 has been the major turning point of my life, he began, describing a life which was then just over half a century long. It was this event that had made him a dissident. In the statement he declared that he had no enemies and no hatred, and spoke of his love for his wife, Liu Xia, who had not been permitted to attend his trial. Your love has been like the sunlight that leaps over high walls and shines through iron windows, that caresses every inch of my skin and warms every cell of my body. Even were I ground to powder, still I would use my ashes to embrace you. Calmly he made the case for his innocence and spoke poignantly of his optimism for a time when China will be a land of free expression, a country where all political views will be spread out beneath the sun for citizens to choose among, and every citizen will be able to express their views without the slightest fear. Westerners can read this message of hope in the full published text of the defense address, but the judge never heard it. Liu Shaobo's time to speak had by then run out. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. The next year he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. His wife, now under house arrest, was not allowed to attend the ceremony in Oslo. The Nobel medal stayed in its small wooden box, and Liu Shaobo was represented on stage by an empty chair. Chapter 10. Amnesia and Memory. We gathered our provisions on the way. In roadside shops we bought incense, candles, long red coils of fireworks, and paper money. The goose was waiting for us at the village, Guojian's cousin told us. We were traveling in convoy. Guojian, his cousin, 9 of his former classmates, and me, on our way to sweep the grave of Guojian's grandfather. In spring, at the festival of Qingming, pure brightness, on April 5th, Chinese people around the world gather at the graves of their ancestors to honor them and make offerings. This would be the first time Guojian had performed this traditional duty for his grandfather. The day had started hazy and cool, but by the time we were nearing his grandfather's village, the sun was burning hot and bright in a brilliant blue sky. As we headed south towards the border with Guangxi province, the limestone karst peaks grew sharper against the horizon, and the foliage a deeper green. We had begun the day in some hilarity, but making our way through the fields to the gravesite, our mood turned solemn. We walked in silence, all of us in a single file except for Guojian and an old auntie from the village who had joined us to help carry bamboo sheaves to place around the grave. Everyone carried a separate offering, white mourning streamers to hang from the bamboo, rice spirit for a libation, fireworks, candles, incense or paper money. In the lead, Guojian's cousin carried a beautiful gray and brown goose, its feathers scalloped and white. Dangling by its legs, it curled its neck up to look at the sky. The grave was in a remote spot far from the village's official cemetery. It was in a patch of uncultivated ground, a place designated for outcasts, for babies, or for others who were deemed to have died too soon, a place for the unlucky and the unblessed. Guojian's grandfather had committed suicide at the age of 37, inside a mountain cave where he had taken shelter from the communist forces in 1951. The People's Liberation Army, PLA, had entered the southern province of Guizhou in 1950 as they pushed south to complete the takeover of the country, which Mao had declared as the People's Republic of China in October 1949. Before the communists came, Guojian's grandfather had been a small farmer whose education had singled him out as a leader. He was a respected figure in his village, but a modest man. When he was approached to represent his district at the National Assembly of China's pre-1949 nationalist government, he had declined, writing simply that he was very proud to be nominated, but too humble to go. But in the new People's Republic, even before this tenuous link to the nationalists was discovered, his status as landlord meant that he was doomed. The fact that his teenage son, Guojian's father, was off fighting with the PLA elsewhere in the country was of no account. He fled from his village into the safety of the hills, but someone reported the smoke from his cooking fire. With the cave surrounded, he decided to shoot himself rather than give himself up. The soldiers tied his body to a plank and carried it down to the village where they paraded him like a trophy through the streets. His wife, Guojian's grandmother, could only stand and watch. Later, his body was dumped outside the village in outcasts' graveyard. It would be more than 30 years before Guojian's father could raise a gravestone on the spot, and 40 years before Guojian persuaded his grandmother to tell him the story. By the end of 1951, almost 2 million landlords had been murdered in China as part of the process of communist land reform. In this period, Mao set a nationwide goal that 1 person per 1,000 should be killed. But in Guizhou, where popular resistance was strong, the toll rose to 3 dead per 1,000. There was never any chance that Guojian's grandfather would have survived if he had not cheated the party by taking his own life. His 2 brothers would die, too. One would be executed, and the other would commit suicide, overdosing on opium that was smuggled to him in prison. We gathered quietly around the grave. Guojian set out small porcelain cups at the base of the gravestone and filled them with rice spirit, while his auntie set up lighted candles. On a small mound above the site, we planted the bamboo sheaves and hung them with white strips of paper for mourning. Guojian's cousin quietly took out a small scythe-shaped knife and slit the goose's throat, letting the blood fall on the stone in front of the grave. Each of us stepped forward to dip paper money in the blood and set it on fire, waving the smoke towards the sky. Guojian and his cousin knelt, and with bundles of incense smoking in their hands, bowed to the grave 3 times, filling the air with scent. Finally, they unrolled a long coil of bright red firecrackers, snaking around the gravestone and up onto the slope, then down around the graveside once more. In his final act of homage to his grandfather, Guojian lit the fuse, and we stood back as the cacophony echoed off the hills, ricocheting from peak to peak until the whole valley filled with sound. After the final explosion, the thunder rolled on, as if the hills themselves were applauding. The next day, Guojian and I walked along a disused railway track, the same rail line that he had taken as he headed off to war 35 years before. The line was being diverted for a new ring road around the city, part of a grand plan to connect his hometown Duying with a neighboring town to create a new megacity, Dayun, Big Dayun. The village he had grown up in had almost entirely disappeared. The Dayun of his youth had nestled below the hills, but the new one fought with them, confronting them with skyscrapers and massive bulldozers, which would level any that stood in the way of development. One hill had already been trucked away to make room for a development zone. I used to be able to walk up the hill at the end of my street and look out on beautiful landscape, Guojian told me. Now walking around the town, I can hardly even see the hills for the buildings. In these small places, they are so in fear of being left behind that they embrace development, however bad, he said, even if it is meaningless and of no benefit to them. All around China there is this fear of being luhou, of being left behind, of being poor, being backward, and so you can't argue with development. It was hard to find much beauty in Dayun, but it struggled on in pockets. The river where Guojian had learnt to swim still ran through the town, and children still played in its fast-flowing water. Behind his school a small hill still stood, covered in ferns and wild rhododendron. He had spent much of his teens playing there, skipping school and raiding the nearby orchards for apples and bayberries. In the streets there was no sign of the traditional dress of the Buyi and Miao people who still dominated the town, but the women at least kicked against the dictates of conventional fashion. Proudly made up, they tottered down the streets in off-kilter boots or sparkly high heels, dressed in lace filigree, lame and embellished leather, heavily embroidered pullovers, and plush-tight skirts. Guojian's parents no longer lived in the town, and the house where he grew up was no longer identifiable on his old street. But some of his old friends were still around, not just the classmates from high school who had shared the pilgrimage to his grandfather's grave, but the ones who had run wild with him when he was just a boy. These friends had grown up with him on the same street, sharing everything in their poverty. One friend's mother even suckling Guojian's younger sister when his mother's breast milk was exhausted. Guojian wanted me to meet them. While his schoolmates had sought out steady jobs and modest comfort, his old street companions had taken chancier and more colorful paths through the new China. One had grown rich as a professional mahjong player, another had ended up as a gangster's bodyguard in Shenzhen, a third was driving his own taxi, while his wife ran a restaurant where we met for lunch. Around a meal of bamboo rat stew, the four of them traded stories of long-lost friends. In the 1980s, it had been a popular choice to go to Shenzhen. Less than 20 kilometers from Hong Kong's border, the new special economic zone had quickly become home to smugglers, drug traffickers, gamblers and pimps, and the tough Douyin boys had made their name as fighters and prized underworld recruits. One of their friends, the smartest of the lot, they said, had become a gangster himself, accumulating wealth and power before falling foul of a rival gang. No one knew for sure, but they assumed he was dead. The one-time gangster's bodyguard stayed quiet through most of this conversation. He'd become an alcoholic while he was away, and he drank steadily through lunch. He was heavily tattooed and missing most of his teeth, a scary sight for those who didn't know him. But he spoke kindly and slowly for my benefit in standard Mandarin Chinese, and opened the car door for me later as we got into their friend's taxi to drive up above the town and look at the view. The last stretch was too steep for the car, so we walked, winding our way up the hills in the shade of the firs, the sunlight filtering through their soft needles onto the ferns that grew in abundance on the forest floor. Birds darted across our path, and there was a smell of honey on the air. Up here, you could see how beautiful Guizhou province could be, until you turned to look at the view. Back in the town, giant diggers were eating away at a hill, leaving just the rind, its hard exposed and churned red soil that stood out against the green of the remaining wooded slopes. In the city again, Guojian and I walked through the streets, looking for landmarks from his past. He found the small bridge over a canal where 30 years before he had met the recruiter from the Minzu University who had changed his life. The water was full of rubbish, much of it brightly colored packaging. Guojian photographed it, focusing on the wrappings that featured the faces of Chinese celebrities, actresses endorsing soap or toothpaste, comedians selling instant noodles. Rubbish culture, he observed with a laugh. When Mao declared the People's Republic in 1949, honoring the dead at Qingming was outlawed along with other such displays of feudalism. But in the years following his death, China's leaders started positioning the government as the inheritor rather than the destroyer of China's traditional past. They recognized the power in these ancient customs and endorsed them as a way of usurping them. In 2008, they declared Qingming a public holiday. But while this stroke of the pen was meant to pronounce the government's respect for the right to remember, The kind of remembering that is tolerated remains tightly circumscribed. Each year the government presides over a massive state-imposed act of forgetting about the events of 1989. In 2014, the 25th anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, they would go to greater lengths than ever to prevent even the smallest act of remembrance, imprisoning people who held private memorials, keeping victims' relatives under police surveillance, scrubbing the internet clean of any reference, and even sending foreign students out of Beijing to keep them from sharing the information with their Chinese classmates as the June 4th anniversary loomed. In the wake of the Tiananmen massacre, the government conducted public mourning for the soldiers who had died in the crackdown, but there's never been any public act of mourning for the demonstrators and ordinary Beijingers who were killed, and attempts by the bereaved to have victims' names listed have been blocked. The government handed down its official verdict on the events in 1989, declaring the demonstrations a counter-revolutionary rebellion, and they have resisted all calls since to change that judgment. Since 1989, history and memory have been key battlegrounds for the government in a war that they are determined will be fought and won on their terms. This insistence extends far beyond Tiananmen events to other disasters of the People's Republic, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and beyond, setting the correct line on the whole sweep of what they like to call China's 5,000 years of civilization. In their version of history, the 100 years leading up to the declaration of the People's Republic was a century of humiliation at the hands of foreigners, which was only ended by the triumph of the Communist Party in 1949. In this narrative, the party is China's historical savior, and the only force that can ensure the nation's continuing rise. With breathtaking nerve, the party claims credit for the defeat of Japan on Chinese soil in 1945, a grueling feat that was almost entirely achieved by the national forces, the Communist Party's rivals in the Chinese Civil War, who were crushed in the Communist victory of 1949. In 1989, as he prepared to send the troops into Tiananmen Square, Deng Xiaoping mused that the biggest mistake the government had made had been to neglect the proper education of its young people. Too much had been made of the mistakes of the communist era, and too much respect paid to what China could learn from the West. A new program of patriotic education must be instituted to ensure young people were reminded of what the party had saved them from, a series of humiliations by the same Western countries whose systems the Tiananmen demonstrators had pointed to for inspiration. Accordingly, since 1990, all Chinese students have taken compulsory courses on the Century of Humiliation, which begins with the Opium Wars and runs through the war with Japan and only ends with the triumph of the Communists in 1949. Man-made disasters such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution are reduced to mere missteps on the otherwise glorious road of national rejuvenation. When I first arrived in China in 1986, the Cultural Revolution was discussed everywhere. The so-called 10 years of turmoil from 1966 through 1976 had weighed heavily in the balance in judging Mao Zedong's legacy. True, most of the commentary focused on individuals rather than the ways in which the system itself had contributed to the disaster. It was also true that, rather like in France, where everyone alive during World War II claims to have been a member of the resistance, in China, you only ever seem to meet victims of the Cultural Revolution, never perpetrators. But there was a general acknowledgement that the period must never be forgotten, and that remembrance would ensure that such a disaster would never again engulf China. However, as I write in 2016, 50 years after the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, the period has been reduced to not much more than a footnote in China's textbooks. Young Chinese have very little conception of what happened in that time. Their ignorance is so profound that, in recent years, fashionable youngsters have embraced a kind of Cultural Revolution chic, as if the period was only about unisex clothing and army surplus. The approved historical narrative is laid out in China's National Museum, situated on Tiananmen Square opposite the Great Hall of the People. There you can view a permanent exhibit entitled The Road of Rejuvenation, which takes the visitor on a journey from the semi-feudal, semi-colonial society to which China had been reduced at the time of the Opium Wars of the 19th century to the glorious history of China under the leadership of the Communist Party. In this exhibit, you'll find whole rooms and dioramas devoted to the humiliation meted out to China by the West, and yet search in vain for more than one ill-lit picture to illustrate the Great Leap Forward, during which tens of millions of Chinese died. The proverbial Martian visitor would conclude that during the 1960s, Nothing notable happened in China at all, save a successful hydrogen bomb test. Needless to say, there's no sign of the events of 1989 in the museum, no sign either of the leaders who steered China's government in the 1980s, no pictures of Hu Yaoban or Zhao Ziyang. But there is a room for the Texan hat Deng Xiaoping donned in his triumphal visit to the United States in 1979, and the jacket that he wore on his Southern inspection tour in 1992, each object sealed in its own glass case. Despite the state-imposed amnesia about inconvenient events, there are still ordinary people and citizen historians around China who attempt to make other stories heard and take back their history from official control. The most poignant of these efforts is that of a group who call themselves the Tiananmen Mothers, bereaved relatives who since 1989 have worked to collect the names and stories of the victims of June 4th. The mothers are led by a retired professor of philosophy from Beijing's People's University, Ding Ziling, whose 17-year-old son was killed when he headed for Tiananmen Square on the night of June 3rd, 1989. Together with the mother of another young student who died on that night, Zhang Xianling, they have gathered the stories of 202 victims whose families were prepared to risk having their loved ones' names listed on the Tiananmen Mothers website. The names include people who were killed when the army fired randomly into residences on their way into the city, like the elderly woman standing on the 14th floor balcony overlooking the Mushidi intersection, or the 66-year-old worker with a wife and 4 children taking shelter in the Hutong home of a relative. There are also the names of young students such as Zhang Shenling's son, who was shot while photographing the army making its way down the Avenue of Eternal Peace towards Tiananmen Square. He bled out on the street while soldiers waved away bystanders who tried to help. Still in high school, he was an inspiring photojournalist, telling his mother that he wanted to record the events for history. Alongside the painstakingly assembled stories of named victims, the mother's investigations also turned up evidence of people whose bodies were cremated by the authorities without being identified. Over the past quarter of a century, the mothers have issued repeated open letters to the government calling for a full accounting of all victims and compensation for their families. They also seek a guarantee of being able to mourn peacefully in public. None of these requests has been granted. Instead, they have been forced into early retirement, have seen their website blocked, been put under surveillance and harassed, and have been required to undertake their small acts of mourning under police supervision. The Tiananmen Mothers are just one group working to reclaim China's history from the official silence. There are also small bands of citizen historians who publish their research in informal journals that circulate only via email so as to circumvent the controls on registered publications. And there are the independent documentary makers such as Beijing-based Wu Wenguan, who in recent years has established a program to send young people back to their home villages to record the memories of those who lived through the Great Leap Forward. Around 220-something aspiring documentarians have in this way discovered the horror of the event, as it played out in their own hometowns years before they were born. Having gathered the names of the victims, some have then raised money to erect gravestones to honor the dead, providing a focus for public mourning in their villages that has been delayed for 6 decades. The most exhaustive study of the Great Leap Forward and the famine that followed in its wake was written by a now retired reporter from China's official news agency called Yang Jishen. Over a period of 15 years, Yang researched this man-made disaster, which claims somewhere between 36 and 45 million lives in the period 1958 through 1962, using his official status to dig into local archives throughout the country and interview surviving witnesses to put together a story that the government has determined should not be told. The official line continues to assert that the famine was a natural disaster, not a catastrophe brought on by Mao's crazed ambition for China to vault straight into the top league of industrialized nation via rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. Yang Jishen's account is called Tombstone. It is banned in China, but around 100,000 illegal copies circulated on the mainland. In the West, the book has been acclaimed as a milestone in Chinese historiography. In the introduction to the English-language version, Yang Jishen writes, "A tombstone is a memory made concrete. Human memory is the ladder on which a country and people advance. The authorities in a totalitarian system strive to conceal their faults and extol their merits, gloss over their errors, and forcibly eradicate all memory of man-made calamity, darkness, and evil. For that reason, the Chinese are prone to historical amnesia imposed by those in power, I raise this tombstone, so people will remember and henceforth renounce man-made calamity, darkness, and evil. The government's determination to control the historical narrative extends to the entire sweep of Chinese history, and it is here that the greatest risk in their approach may lie. Their approved accounts imagines a single, indivisible, changeless China. The historically distinct regions of Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia, which lie at the country's far western and northern borders, are declared to have always been part of China. But the frontiers of the modern state were only drawn in the 18th century under the Qing Emperor Qianlong. For the next century and a half, China's hold on its most far-flung territories strengthened and weakened as power ebbed and flowed at the center. After 1949, the communist regime cemented Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia into the People's Republic. But to claim that these regions have always been Chinese negates millennia of independent history and turns rich cultural legacies into footnotes to the official Chinese narrative. The truth, which the government vehemently rejects, is that China's relationships with its border cultures is a colonial one. Just like colonial powers in years past, the government is struggling with the question of how their subject people's sense of their own identity and history should be accommodated. These are not easy questions, but as the recent history of Xinjiang and Tibet has shown, denial and negation is not the answer. I first encountered Xinjiang in a suburb of Beijing one spring night in 1986. In those days, there still existed in the northwest of the city a mysterious area called Weigongkun, a one-time village that had been home to the Uyghur community in the capital since the Yuan dynasty, 1271 through 1368. Deep into the night, a dark, unpaved street that hugged the north wall of Minzu University, a small restaurant served out platefuls of long, slippery, chewy noodles smothered in tomatoes and peppers. I rode there on my bicycle with my friends Bruce Dorr and Sue Doerr. They were sinologists, fluent in Chinese, both classical and modern. Brilliant scholars of China's archaeological past, they had a particular fascination for the cultures of the borderlands of China, Xinjiang and Tibet, and it was through them that I first began to understand those regions. Inside, the restaurant was warm, bright, and crowded, the air heavy with the scent of lamb and tomatoes, with fleeting undertones of hashish. Through the kitchen hatch, you could see a young man in an embroidered cap performing the nightly miracle of la mian, as noodles were known. He started with a round of dough, which he rolled, twisted, spun, and then, with a conjurer's trick that I never spotted, formed a skein of thick noodles with his fingers, divided and doubled them, redoubled them again, and flicked them into the bubbling pot. That night was the first time I heard Uyghur spoken, a Turkic language of long rills and whip-cracked consonants. I knew that Xinjiang lay at the heart of the Silk Road, and that ancient traders had made Xinjiang's southwestern city of Kashgar into one of its most important trading posts. But I knew nothing then of the history of the Turkic peoples, whose khanates, kingdoms, and empires had spread across Central Asia and Siberia, long before they moved west into Anatolia to found the Ottoman Empire, the precursor to the modern state of Turkey. It took me another 8 years before I finally got to Xinjiang itself, taking the train to Urumqi with an ABC camera crew in the autumn of 1994. Sally Neighbor and I had been talking about going there from the first time we met. We shared a romantic craving for it, and particularly to see Kashgar, that fabled crossing point of cultures. We had also heard rumors of trouble out there, a stirring of agitation for autonomy, which drew us as journalists. The night before we set out for the West, we went to see Xinjiang Band play at the capital's first live music venue, Poachers. Bruce Dorr had told us that if we really wanted to get a feel for modern Xinjiang culture, we had to see Grey Wolf. They were led, as it turned out, by a guy called Askar, the younger brother of the artist Anwar, who I had recently met for the first time. And so on the eve of our journey we found ourselves jammed against a stage, mesmerized by this charismatic rocker who serenaded us with songs of deserts and mountains, wolves and wild spaces, and beautiful Russian girls who broke your heart. They were playing ordinary rock instruments, but you could hear the ancient rhythms of the Silk Road and all its way stations from Persia to Spain. And in the crowd, among the rest of us bopping and voguing, were the Xinjiang-born dancers, the men straight-backed and courtly, spinning and bowing to their partners, the women's arms gracefully, sinuously held aloft. It was exhilarating to feel in the crowd the power of China's multi-layered culture, especially in the band, with its mixed lineup of Uyghurs and Han Chinese. It was a Silk Road brought to life, a highway that connected east to west. Arriving in Xinjiang's capital, Urumqi, a few days later was a jolt. By comparison to today, the military presence was mild, but it was still a shock to come upon soldiers holding mock target practice in the main city square. The message from the local governor, on the other hand, was specific. We worked hard to get him to admit that there were any problems at all. In the end, he did refer to an extreme tiny number of people who wanted to divide and destroy. The contrast with the official line today is stark, with the government talking up every sign of trouble to support its narrative of an existential threat. The ABC crew and I headed for Kashgar by plane. Bruce Dorr likes to tell the story of Xinjiang air travel in the old days, when flight security was a smiling cabin attendant who would make her way down the aisle before takeoff, collecting knives and ceremonial daggers on a tray for return to their owners after landing. Sadly, security on our flight was less colorful and more tense, a sign of the times in 1994. The plane was an ancient Tupolev that came with its own gloomy Russian crew. Once we had grown our way to cruising altitude, I tried to take my mind off the rattles filling the cabin by admiring the snow-capped Tian Shan mountains below and listening to Lara's theme, which played over the cabin speakers all the way to Kashgar. Kashgar was a beautiful town then, at its heart the adobe old city molded from earth on which it was built, a maze of streets that dated to the time of Marco Polo. To the Uyghurs, it was Kashgar, and not the army-dominated new town of Urumqi that was their true capital. The Sunday market teemed with traders, selling everything from bolts of local hand-loomed silk and camel hair rugs to fat-tailed lambs and sturdy Mongolian ponies. In its alleys, smelling sweetly of Iranian saffron and cloves, were stalls selling consumer goods from the factories of inland China, too. The border had reopened with Pakistan in 1987, and there was now a crackling trade across the Karakoram Mountains. As in the rest of China, the 1980s in Xinjiang had not seen just an economic transformation, but a cultural resurgence, too. Private trading, long banned under Mao, had returned along with traditional crafts, music, dancing, and other arts that had been banned during the Cultural Revolution. Religious observance was no longer outlawed, and in those years even Communist Party cadres were allowed to follow Islam. More genuine autonomy was also proposed for Xinjiang, with the promotion of more Uyghurs into government. But as with the rest of China, the events of 1989 were a watershed. From 1990, the laissez-faire attitude to religion was wound back, and a fear of Uyghur nationalism grew. When the Soviet Union broke up in the early 1990s, it created independent Turkic-speaking nations, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, just beyond Xinjiang's borders. The government moved to increase Han Chinese migration to Xinjiang and to draw its economy into closer integration with the rest of the country. Despite this, Kashgar's sense of itself as something distinct was palpable to us. Wandering through the back alleys of the old city near the Adka Mosque, we met a carpet trader, heavily bearded and of venerable age, who invited us into his home to talk. As we sat down with him on a brightly colored rug, he and his wife piled up food around us, plates of freshly baked naan bread, slices of watermelon, sun-dried raisins, jewel-like sweets, and tea sweetened with pieces of sparkling rock sugar. This old man saw the story of Kashgar in terms of millennia, during which 200 years of Chinese rule didn't seem especially significant. His house had stood unchanged for twice as long as that, he remarked. Overarching everything for him was his faith. Kashgar was among the first of Xinjiang's city to convert to Islam, an event dated to 960, 1,000 years before we sat down to talk. The coming of the Chinese had made no difference to that basic fact. He suggested there would be a continuing accommodation. We do what we do, and the Chinese do what they do, and that's the way it's always been. But elsewhere in Kashgar there were signs that others were not so philosophical. Not far from where we were staying was a burnt-out government building, still not repaired after a firebomb attack some months before. It was said to be one of a series of such attacks in retaliation for the bloody suppression of an incident in a neighboring town in the spring of 1990. The official story was of a planned armed uprising by members of an Eastern Turkestan Islamic Party, in which hundreds of rioters surrounded government buildings in the town, eventually killing 6 police officers. The army then moved in, killing the ringleader and 16 other rebels. An alternative account was of a peaceful demonstration that only turned violent as a standoff developed. Whatever the truth, a subsequent Amnesty International report suggested as many as 50 rioters were killed in the incident, but the true figure may never be known. Despite this dark undertone to our visit in 1994, I had fallen in love with Xinjiang. When I returned to China in 2004, I resolved to visit the region every summer, and I did so for 3 years. On each trip, I would return to Kashgar, and from there set off to explore the other oasis towns that hugged the southern rim of the Taklamakan Desert. There was Kargilak on the back road into Tibet, a town of adobe houses with vine-shaded courtyards, home to an exquisite decoratively bricked mosque and a wild public park filled with hollyhocks and vegetable allotments, where the local teenagers roller skated around a homemade rink to the sounds of Boney M yelling, "Rah, rah, Rasputin," 400 kilometers from Moscow. It was in the park at Kargilak that a group of old men got talking to me, and I realized I had forgotten to pack 2 essentials for Silk Road travel: pictures of my family and a range of foreign banknotes, both a source of fascination in Xinjiang. As it was, my collection of Chinese currency became a wry conversation piece. As we examined the 100-yuan bill, one of the men touched the placid features of the great helmsman with a wrinkled finger. "There's Mao," he said expressionlessly. 50 yuan, he suggested, and when I proffered it, he looked at it with a hint of a smile. "There he is again." 20 yuan, 10, 5, 1. I brought them out in turn. "Mao, Mao, Mao, and Mao," they murmured. Finally, I produced one of those grimy scapes of paper that denoted 10 Chinese cents. No portrait of Chairman Mao this time, just 2 men in profile drawn to represent China's ethnic minorities. "Oh yes," my companion said, "here is us," and fell about laughing. Further along the South Silk Road was Yarkand, once home to traders from India, Bukhara, and beyond, its back streets still filled with craftsmen hand-turning poplar wood into decorative banisters and columns for its graceful terraced buildings with their shaded verandas. In the summer, the faithful prayed beneath a grape arbor, and when a young girl spied me lingering at the carved open gates, she picked some of the mosque's grapes for me to eat. In this town, the grandest monument was for Amnisa Khan, 1526 to 1560, the queen of Yarkand Khanate, a composer and musician who collected and preserved the 12 mukam, the great song cycle of the Uyghur people. Around her tomb, children played and families picnicked among the graves of their ancestors. In the orchards heavy with apricots, pomegranates, and pears, and in the fields full of corn, women worked in bright silk dresses and high-heeled shoes, wearing only a light scarf on their hair. In 2006, I spent a whole summer in Kashgar, passing my days gossiping with the women who worked in my hotel as they laid out plump apricots to dry in the sun. In the cool of the late afternoon, I would walk the streets of the town, drawn by the sound of the call to prayer from the Adaka Mosque, watching goldsmiths fashioning dowry jewelry in the crowded side streets, listening at the doors instrument makers tried their inlaid long-necked lutes and taut-hide-covered drums. Wedding parties would parade in the main streets, announced by an open truck full of trumpeting musicians, while women zipped past on scooters, resplendent in brightly colored skirts and high-heeled sandals. I ate all my meals off the street, dinners of fat chunks of lamb skewered over an open brazier, breakfasts of rich Kashgar pilaf and rose-petal tea. By the time I returned to Xinjiang again in the summer of 2009, everything had changed. Asghar and his band were heading for Australia to play the Darwin Festival in August of that year, and I had arranged to profile them for the Australian newspaper. My idea was to interview Asghar in Urumqi, where he was spending the summer with his family, and then head on to Kashgar. He and his band had become stars in China. With 5 Uyghur and 3 Han members, they had worked traditional Uyghur instruments into their standard rock lineup: 2 lutes, 1 bowed and the other plucked, and a simple hand drum called a dap. Playing with fiendish genre-busting intensity, Grey Wolf could bring a room full of stone lions to their feet, especially when Asghar's wife, an acclaimed traditional dancer, came whirling onto the stage. By 2001, they had a top 10 hit and were chosen to support the 3 tenors in their concert at the Forbidden City. By the time they were picked for the Darwin Festival, they had toured countries from the Philippines to France. On July 5, 2009, bloody riots broke out in Urumqi. Trouble started with a demonstration by over 1,000 Uyghurs in the People's Square. The spark for the demonstration was a report of an ugly incident of Han xenophobia among factory workers in far-off Guangzhou that had flared into anti-Uyghur riots, leaving a reported 2 Xinjiang workers dead and dozens injured. Video of the incident that circulated online, however, suggested a heavier toll. The crowd were demanding an inquiry, and their anger was swelled by deeper currents of resentment. Uyghurs felt that for some years, Han migration to Xinjiang had been closing off job opportunities and forcing young Uyghurs onto the road in search of work. So in Uyghur eyes, the Guangzhou riot casualties were not just victims, but unwilling exiles from their homeland. From early 2009, tensions had been rising as the government started bulldozing vast swaths of the historic old city of Kashgar. The official pretext, laughable and maddening to Uyghurs, was that these buildings that had stood for centuries were not earthquake-proof. In their place, characterless developments were going up, and most of the former residents were being rehoused on the city fringes. On July 5th, when some demonstrators were being arrested at the People's Square in Urumqi, a standoff quickly developed in the streets near the Grand Bazaar. The Chinese government maintains that the subsequent riots were part of a plot by an international Uyghur separatist group. Locals say the spark was police brutality. The violence was shocking. Innocent Han Chinese were suddenly targets, and it took the police a full day to regain control of the city. In the days that followed, armed Han civilians paraded through the streets in a show of force, while news of retaliatory attacks by Han on Uyghurs spread. The official toll was finally reported as 197 dead and 1,721 injured, the majority being Han Chinese. These were allegations by Uyghur advocacy groups that the official Uyghur death toll was underreported. But even so, the way resentment had spilled over into anti-Han violence was sickening and undeniable. In the days after the riots, thousands of Uyghurs were arrested, with many remaining unaccounted for months later. 2 weeks after the riots, I took the long flight across the plains of North China and the snow-capped Tian Shan Range to Urumqi. Despite the trouble, I was determined to write the Askar article as planned. It seemed more vital than ever to write about a band whose very makeup spoke to a better possibility. I arrived in a city that was effectively under martial law. My hotel, near the old Uyghur Bazaar, overlooked the barracks of the People's Armed Police, China's internal paramilitary security force. The courtyard was a parking lot for military lorries and white-painted personnel carriers decked with minatory slogans about ethnic harmony. I woke the next morning to the crash of boots and shouted orders. In the streets near the Grand Bazaar, truckloads of troops rolled by, staring into the street through Perspex riot shields. At each corner of the main square stood police squads in groups of 4, one armed with a semi-automatic weapon, the other 3 with meter-long wooden clubs. Camouflage canvas umbrellas shaded them from the Central Asian sun. I walked past 2 young Uyghur girls kneeling in the main square, a picture of a young man, their missing brother, displayed on the rug in front of them. The bazaar, usually alive with people bargaining over everything from dried apricots to reindeer horn, was almost empty. "Buy something, a spice seller pleaded as I walked by. I visited Askar at home, the apartment full of the children of his extended family watching a dubbed version of The Truman Show. The usual outdoor pursuits of summer had been abandoned. People felt safer inside. What I had planned as an enjoyable talk about his career proceeded uneasily. We started to talk about how his songs had recently begun to explore the theme of environmental loss. I asked him about one he called Tears of Kashgar, a lament for the vanishing beauties of his hometown. He told me that the song had originally been called Rainbow, inspired by the revelation that his Beijing-reared son had never seen this simple natural wonder. "It made me think of so many things that I could see easily when I was young," he said, "and also of how harmonious things were back then. It was never a question of people being Uyghur or Han. Everyone got on because everyone's life was the same." Unspoken as we sat talking was the reality of modern Xinjiang, where economic development had sharpened divisions and the idyllic beauty of the old oasis towns was giving way to high-rise and glitz. Unspoken also was the tragedy then unfolding in Kashgar as the old city was bulldozed away. I tried to probe these themes with him, but he gently cut me off. "I believe in peace," he said, and I could not ask him more. In 2009, some hoped that the scale of the violence in Urumqi might lead the government to look for ways to deal with the underlying cause of the unrest. But instead, the government chose to go harder, doubling down, as longtime observer Nicholas Becklen, now of Amnesty International, put it, on the economic policies that are creating political tensions, to even accelerate further things that alienate Uyghurs such as rehousing and resettlement, pursuing even more invasive economic activities in the region. In the 21st century, the situation in both Tibet and Xinjiang has got steadily worse, with both regions now under heightened security, enduring an even more oppressive system of surveillance and militarized policing. In both places, Han Chinese immigration has proceeded apace, while locals endure endless needle pricks of religious and cultural control. Since the Lhasa riots of March 2008, some 144 Tibetans living within China have set themselves on fire in protest against the regime. These desperate acts have proved an embarrassment, and the Chinese government does what it can to ensure they go unreported. The situation in Xinjiang is worse. Ever tighter policies of surveillance and control are creating what the government professes most to fear: radicalization and terrorism. In October 2013, a four-wheel drive vehicle crashed in Tiananmen Square, bursting into flames and killing its occupants and 2 tourists who were walking near Tiananmen Gate. Inside the car were 3 Uyghurs from Xinjiang, a male driver accompanied by his wife and mother. Journalists tried in vain to learn why these 3 would have committed suicide in such a terrible way. There was talk that they were in despair over the destruction of their local mosque back home, but the Beijing authorities branded them as radical Islamist separatists. A few months later, in March 2014, a deadlier attack took place at the main railway station in Kunming, the capital of Yunnan province. A group of 8 people, 6 men and 2 women, attacked passengers with knives in a random and horrific attack in which 29 people were killed and many more injured. Then, in April that same year, 3 people were killed and dozens wounded in a coordinated bomb and knife attack in Urumqi railway station. A month later, there was another attack in Urumqi by 5 assailants who drove 2 SUVs into a popular food market and threw bombs into the crowd, killing 39 people. There is no doubt that at least the last 3 of these attacks constituted terrorism, bloody and calculated violence designed for effect. But terrorism is a slippery label when it comes to Xinjiang. The 3 attacks occurred amidst a series of murkier incidents, also branded as terrorism, but which look more like an embattled populace reacting to excessive levels of control. In all of these cases, the government resorted to deadly force in the name of China's war on terror. In July 2014, Chinese authorities reported that a mob armed with knives and axes had attacked a police station in a small village near Yarkand, and 96 people had been killed, 37 bystanders, and 59 people who the police identified as terrorists. According to the authorities, the mob had attacked after a crackdown in the town had turned up a cache of explosives. An investigation by the Uyghur-speaking reporters at Radio Free Asia, however, suggested an alternative account. The crowd marched on the police station after a crackdown on religious observance during Ramadan and the extrajudicial killing of a Uyghur family in a neighboring town. Faced with a rioting mob, the police had opened fire. This was just the most bloody of a series of violent incidents involving rioters and police in Xinjiang over recent years, each of which suggests a boiling over of violence rather than premeditated attacks. In June 2013, 35 people were killed in a violent confrontation between rioters and police in the town of Luchinio Turfan. Reporters observed that this followed a particularly heavy-handed campaign by police against the wearing of religious clothing that had been proceeding for months. This riot was also termed an act of terrorism. Meanwhile, the government pursues ever more petty restriction on Xinjiang's traditional culture and religion in the name of preventing extremism. Long beards and traditional veiling have been outlawed, with house-to-house searches mounted to enforce the ban. Shops are forced to sell alcohol, and police monitor stocks to make sure that this provocative edict is obeyed. Students, public servants, and party members are all banned from observing the Ramadan fast. No one under 18 is allowed to pray in the mosque. All of these restrictions are policed under a policy that stipulates that every household in the village in Xinjiang is assigned an officer who is tasked with keeping tabs on them and is empowered to visit at any time. Observers believe that many of the minor violent incidents that have been reported as terrorism in Xinjiang in recent years have been in response to such intrusions by police into people's homes. Throughout the province, people have been encouraged to report their neighbors if they suspect any illegal religious or separatist activity and are paid for the tip-offs. Small wonder that this relentless pressure, along with the steady movement of Han immigrants into Xinjiang, feeds a conviction among Uyghurs that their culture is under threat, while they are offered little in exchange. The upper levels of provincial governance are controlled by Han Chinese. Uyghurs are disadvantaged in competing for government jobs. Teaching in the native Uyghur language of Xinjiang is now severely restricted, and opportunities for tertiary study in Uyghur have largely been closed off. Hundreds of people have been sentenced for a wide range of offenses, including spreading propaganda, manufacturing weapons, and inciting ethnic hatred. Sentences including death sentences have been passed during mass trials conducted in sports stadia, a style of justice made popular during the Cultural Revolution. The tragedy is that demonizing cultural and religious expression and criminalizing even the slightest dissent is creating the very problem that the government say they are trying to combat. The promise of autonomy that was very real in the early days of the People's Republic and even as late as the 1980s rings increasingly hollow. Authorities now talk openly about the need for Sinification in Xinjiang and Tibet, and in both places large-scale settlement of Han Chinese is gradually changing the facts on the ground, so as to one day to leave no room for dispute that these regions are anything but Chinese. The cultures of China's ethnic minorities are already treated as little more than colorful novelties. This reached its nadir during the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics. A group of children in exotic ethnic costumes carried a huge Chinese flag into the arena, while a Han Chinese girl lip-synced a powerful rendition of Ode to the Motherland. Just days later, it emerged that the children did not actually come from the country's different ethnic groups at all. They were all Han Chinese children, hailing from no further away than Beijing. When outed, Olympic officials were baffled by the fuss. They pointed out it was common practice to represent China's minorities this way, while the leader of the Beijing troupe, which had supplied the children, said later it would have been too much trouble to find real ethnic children, and, anyhow, how could you be sure they would behave? The most influential Uyghur public intellectual in China, Ilham Tohti, tried for some years to put forward concrete proposals to ease the situation in Xinjiang. Ilham was an associate professor in the economics department at Minzu University, a charismatic figure who had set up a website called Uyghur Online to act as a forum for discussion of issues between Han Chinese and Uyghurs. The website was blocked in China from the day after the trouble broke out in 2009, but he still offered to work as a bridge between Uyghurs and Han Chinese. He wrote of the need for the government to deliver on the promise of autonomy for ethnic minorities that is enshrined in the Chinese Constitution, and counseled against petty crackdowns on cultural expressions such as long beards and the wearing of headscarves. He talked of the atmosphere of fear that had been generated by years of ever-increasing repression and control. He made detailed suggestions for addressing the economic disadvantage and discrimination that was at the root of the resentments in Xinjiang. In all of this, he was at pains to state that he believed Xinjiang's future was within China and that he opposed any separatist agenda. He also was a staunch opponent of violence. In January 2011, he wrote an autobiographical essay, My Ideals and the Path I Have Chosen. He wrote, Whether looking vertically at Chinese history or horizontally at the world today, it's clear that the greater a country's cultural diversity and tolerance, the greater its creativity. Any thinking that doggedly stresses a particular group's cultural uniqueness and superiority, thus making it non-inclusive, is close-minded and a thing of the past. It will inevitably kill the culture it means to enshrine and protect. I hope that China, having endured many misfortunes, will become a great nation of harmonious inter-ethnic coexistence and develop a splendid civilization. On January 15, 2014, Ilham was arrested at his home in Beijing and taken to a prison in Xinjiang. A month later, he was charged with separatism and in September 2014 was sentenced to life in prison. Dissident Chinese writer Wang Lixiong tweeted that in jailing Ilham, the Chinese government had created the Uyghur Mandela. Prominent Chinese activist and Sakharov Prize winner Hu Jia was brave enough to state the obvious, that the guilty verdicts show the Chinese authority don't want the Uyghurs to have any voice at all. If anyone was in any doubt of the government's zero tolerance for Uyghur dissent after Ilham's sentence, that was dispelled by the subsequent jailing of 7 of his students who were said to have been bewitched and coerced into working for his website. The cruelty of Ilham Tohti's life sentence was underlined when the court also ordered his assets seized, leaving his wife and young children without financial support. His wife, who was in court to hear the verdict, remained unbowed. "No matter what happens, I will wait for him to come home," she said. "We will wait forever." By the time Ilham Tohti was sentenced in September 2014, it was already clear that China had entered a new era of repression, ushered in with the ascension to power in late 2012 of China's new paramount leader, Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is a princeling, son of the Mao's comrade-in-arms, Xi Zhongxun. As a descendant of the first generation of China's revolutionary leaders, he is part of a cohort who believe that they are the heirs to the party's primal legitimacy and have a duty to safeguard it. When the younger Xi first rose to power, many took to heart from the fact that his late father had been a moderate, persecuted and imprisoned under Mao, a prime supporter of Deng Xiaoping's reforms. Xi's father was particularly associated with the early success of southern China's special economic zones and was later believed to have been a defender of Huyaoban and a critic of the crackdown in 1989. He was also known for his sympathy with China's ethnic minorities. As it turned out, it was not his father's example that Xi Jinping looked to in forming his own approach to leadership. Soon after he took over as General Secretary of the Communist Party in November 2012, Xi gave a speech musing on the lessons China should take from the fall of the Soviet Communist Party and the subsequent breakup of the Soviet Union. His verdict: the Soviet communists had allowed their ideals and beliefs to be shaken, and when the challenge came, nobody was man enough to resist the fall of the party and the disintegration of the USSR. Soon after he achieved the top job in late 2012, his strategy to save the Communist Party began to unfold. First, there would be an unprecedented crackdown on corruption, one that would catch both high-placed tigers and low-level flies who had used their positions to make themselves and their families rich. As I write, the anti-corruption campaign is still unfolding. Today, the running tally on the website China File, which tracks those individuals whose persecutions have been announced, stands at 1,740, of whom 176 are tigers and the rest are all flies. Apart from these formal cases, observers estimate hundreds of thousands of party members have been caught up in some way in the investigation. Some have questioned the motivations behind the campaign, noting that none of Xi's allies, and indeed no princelings at all, have been implicated, while allies of former presidents and leaders of the Communist Party, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, have not been so lucky. Most likely the campaign has a dual purpose: to win respect for the party for putting their house in order, while consolidating Xi's position by eroding competing power bases. The second prong to Xi's strategy to entrench the party is a wide-ranging crackdown on alternative voices in society. The first to feel the chill on his ascension were the rights lawyers, but the campaign soon spread to other activists, NGOs, journalists, popular figures on Weibo, China's version of Twitter, representatives of Christian churches, and even feminists. Under Xi, a string of lawyers and activists have been charged with a crime that would seem laughable if it didn't lead to jail time. Picking quarrels and provoking troubles, a catch-all concept covering such peaceful exercises of civil liberty as publicizing a defendant's case, organizing strikes, opposing housing demolitions, or arranging a demonstration against sexual harassment on public transport. The crackdown on individuals has been accompanied by an intense effort to clean up the internet, where an army of party operatives toils to delete any opinion or information that doesn't fit the official line. The crackdown on alternative voices has led to a succession of travesties of justice. The treatment of Ilham Tohti may be the most egregious, but he is not alone in being jailed for peacefully promoting solutions to acknowledged social problems. In January 2014, prominent rights lawyer and activist Xu Zhiyong was sentenced to 4 years in prison for gathering crowds to disturb public order after he organized small-scale protests calling for equal education opportunities for children of workers in China's floating population and for a public register of officials' assets. She had co-founded a group called the New Citizens Movement, which aimed to promote constitutionalism in China. In court, she read out a defiant statement at the close of the trial. What the New Citizens Movement advocates is for each and every Chinese national to act and behave as a citizen, to accept our roles as citizens and masters of our country, and not to act as feudal subjects, remain complacent, accept mob rule or position as an underclass, You say we harbored political purposes. Well, we do, and our political purpose is very clear, and it is a China with democracy, rule of law, freedom, justice, and love. The continuing crackdown on alternative voices such as these is aimed at protecting the party's monopoly over law and policy. Behind it runs the specter of the old Soviet Union, and the fear that if the party was to give up even a little of its prerogative to set China's course, it would undermine the principle of one-party rule. Even where a citizen's suggestion accords with the announced policy, as with Xu Zhiyong's proposed register of officials' assets, a key anti-corruption mechanism, it must still be rejected. This insistence on total control has led to the situation where even to promote observance of China's own constitution is deviant behavior. Constitutionalism is now routinely demonized in party media. Perhaps this is not surprising, since the Chinese constitution is full of inconvenient clauses about respect for human rights, freedom of speech, the right to criticize any state organ or functionary, and the rights of citizens in autonomous areas. In late 2013, an internal Communist Party document was leaked that provides a telling glimpse of the party's fears and insecurities. Known as Document 9, the circular listed 7 false ideological positions which are a threat to party-imposed stability. These perils include Western constitutional democracy, universal values, the primacy of individual rights, Western-style journalism, and historical nihilism, that is, critiquing the party's version of history. The document argues, by rejecting Chinese Communist Party, CCP history and the history of New China, historical nihilism seeks to fundamentally undermine the CCP's historical purpose, which is tantamount to denying the legitimacy of the CCP's long-term political dominance. Tellingly, one of the document's examples of nihilism is rejecting the accepted conclusions on historical events. This is as clear a statement as it is possible to find of the party's determination to win the war for control of the national memory. One of the key battlegrounds in that war is Tiananmen Square and the events of June 4th, 1989. In early May 2014, a month after we had traveled to Guizhou together, I went to visit Guo Jian in his studio in Songzhuan, an artist's village outside Beijing's city limits. Having lost yet another studio to developers, he was camping above his new workspace, which was crammed with canvases, found objects, art books, and half-completed projects. Among them was a miniature 3-dimensional model of Tiananmen Square. He had been working on this diorama since 2010, adding new elements to a fantasy scene of the square threatened by bulldozers on the ground and helicopter gunships in the air. It was intended as a studio piece only, as no gallery would consider a work full of such dark resonance, even though the gunships and bulldozers were meant as a commentary on the relentlessness of urban development. As the 25th anniversary of June 4th loomed, he decided the diorama would say something else. He had covered the whole scene in minced meat and invited me out to see the work in progress. As I walked through the open door, I was assaulted with the odor of rotting meat. He had only been working for a day, but the 50 kilograms of minced pork was already on the turn. The smell added the shock of seeing the familiar buildings of Tiananmen Square, the monument to the people's heroes, the Great Hall of the People, Mao's mausoleum, disappearing under red minced flesh. We retreated outside to talk. Of course he wasn't going to show the work, he told me, but he was going to get a friend to document it on video. I asked what he planned to say if anyone in authority came snooping. He would tell them the truth, he said, with an innocent grin. It was inspired by the meat sculptures he had seen at the Royal Easter Agricultural Show in Sydney. We talked about how happy his father was that Guo Jian had finally swept his grandfather's grave. This act of filial piety had started a whole new conversation between them about the past, about his grandfather's life and death, and his father's story too. But as we chatted, it was hard to escape the pall of the looming anniversary. The pre-June crackdown had started early that year, and news had just broken of the arrest of the rights lawyer Pu Zhiqiang. Pu had been arrested after attending a private gathering to commemorate June 4th. His Weibo account, which had hundreds of thousands of followers, was silent, but everywhere else the web was humming with the news, with comments being deleted as fast as they appeared. For all that, Pu was a thorn in the authorities' side, most recently for his defense of the dissident artist Ai Weiwei. The respect he commanded had made him seem untouchable. He'd even made the cover of state-run China Newsweek the previous December, lauded as the most influential person promoting the rule of law in the country. That he should have been detained seemed a particularly bad omen. I was back in Sydney when I got the message that Guo Jian had been arrested. It was early on Sunday, June 1st, and the news was spreading fast among his friends on the popular message app, WeChat. We'd all seen the interview he had given to the Financial Times that had appeared the day before. In it, he had talked at length about the events of 1989, and reading it, I had felt a sense of pride at his bravery, mixed with a sinking feeling that this year he wouldn't get away with it. He had never avoided the subject, and he had discussed it with journalists before, but this was the 25th anniversary, with a new and prickly leadership team in power. Around the world, Guo Jian's friends sat waiting for news. When the police came to his studio, it was past midnight on the day the article appeared. The mincemeat had long been cleared away, and the Tiananmen diorama was clean and white once more. He was expecting them. By that time, dozens of intellectuals and activists had been detained, and the interview had put him under a spotlight. That day, he had got a haircut and had had his nails done as well. His army training had taught him a bit about preparing for rough conditions. Even though he was ready for it, the knock sounded terribly loud when it came. Some of the police were in uniform, others in plain clothes. One carried a video camera and worked his way around the room shooting anything that looked significant. The senior officer took Guo Jian aside and showed him his police badge. They soon focused on the diorama and called over the video officer. "Evidence," he said, zooming in on tanks and soldiers. "Let's go down to the station and have a talk," said the man in charge. They took him to the local station, where relays of police interviewed him through the night. One group concentrated on his visa and his finances, while another quizzed him on his art and his ideas. "Do you hate the government?" they asked ominously. "Do you think the students did nothing wrong?" Occasionally they grilled him on details, hoping to prove he had never been in Tiananmen Square in the first place. Most of the time they tried to chip away at his position on the events. After some hours, the lead interrogator said, "So you still think the government was wrong for what they did on June 4th? "Yes," Guo Jian replied. "I do." "So tell us what they should have done instead." "You had thousands of soldiers," said Guo Jian. "You didn't need to kill anyone. You only did it because you were scared." One of the young officers was furious. "Do you think I don't understand about this stuff? That I'm too young? I've read books about it." After dawn, a new officer turned up and calmly suggested a way out. "He said I should sign a self-criticism," Guo Jian told me later. "He wanted me to say I was wrong about Tiananmen Square. Wrong in what I said to the media, wrong in general. He said to me, 'This is not your business. You should leave this stuff to the leaders. Just do your art and leave the stuff to others.'" Guo Jian then asked them what his punishment would be. Their first condition was that the diorama should be destroyed. Guo Jian had always planned to destroy it, so he readily agreed. "Then," Guo Jian told me, "they said there would be a short detention, and after that, if I kept my head down, did my painting and didn't talk to any foreign media, it would all be fine." But then another group of police arrived, and he realized it wasn't going to be so straightforward after all. By now the Australian embassy had been asking questions, and suddenly the issue wasn't Tiananmen Square or Guo Jian's ideas or his art. The police were going to charge him over a visa irregularity. At 5 p.m., they took him back to his studio. They gathered around the diorama and told him to destroy it. Guo Jian duly smashed it up, with the police video camera rolling. "I was sad about it," Guo Jian told me, "because it was a work I loved so much. But at the same time, it was exciting, because from the beginning I'd planned to destroy it. To do it surrounded by police, and them filming me. It was really kind of perfect." Finally, at midnight, they delivered him to the Daxing Detention Center in Beijing. His penalty had been agreed: 15 days detention, a 5,000 yuan fine, and deportation to Australia. They told him the deportation period need not be for very long if he did the right thing, stick to his art, and not talk to the foreign media. His cell was about 5 meters long, and already home to 12 other inmates who shared 8 beds between them. I guess I was a bit scared at first, but then I realized it wasn't much different from being in the army. The worst thing was boredom. After breakfast, they were told to sit on a wooden bench, and they weren't permitted to read or walk around the cell. They were monitored by video, and if anyone stood up, even for a moment, the guard would blow into the microphone of the PA system, making a roaring bark that served as a warning. The television, tuned to a special prison station, played documentaries about the enormities committed against China by foreigners. There were shows on the Opium Wars and different foreign invasions, and about how AIDS was destroying the West. In the afternoon, they could walk around their cell. On a few of the days, they got 1 hour to walk outside. He befriended a young man from Paraguay, who also had visa issues, but had still not been able to get news to his family or girlfriend about his plight. His relief when he discovered that Guojian could speak English was overwhelming. "It's a cliché, but of course you think about freedom all the time when you are inside," Guojian told me. "And when you see a bird outside perched on the wire, it really does remind you how precious and fragile freedom is." After he had been in detention for a few days, the television program suddenly changed. They started broadcasting all these great movies into our cell, like Mission Impossible, number 1 through 3. It turned out the improvement in programming presaged a consular visit by 2 Australian embassy officials. Guojian didn't know it, but his plight was big news in Australia, with the Australian foreign minister herself expressing concern. When the diplomats asked him how he was, Guojian could assure them that he was fine, and that he even had HBO. On the day of Guojian's release, his friend from Paraguay still hadn't managed to contact his family, and he begged Guojian to call his girlfriend when he got to Sydney. They had no paper, so Guojian carved the phone number into a piece of soap and slipped it into his pocket. They took him to the airport and drove straight onto the tarmac to the stairs of an Air China flight. The crew settled him into a seat on an exit row opposite 2 of the attendants who would keep a wary eye on him throughout the flight. Once airborne, he asked for a drink, but the flight attendant told him in her best apologetic manner that they were under instructions not to serve him alcohol. He smiled and thought back to his first flight to Sydney 20 years before, when 2 Australian beers, far stronger than he was used to, had just about knocked him flat. In Sydney, he stepped into the arrivals hall carrying the few belongings he'd been allowed to collect from his studio, his mobile phone and laptop, and some clothes in a gym bag. In his pocket was a scrap of prison soap that would help him keep a promise to a friend. Chapter 11. The People and the Republic. On January 12, 2013, a choking blanket of smog settled across Beijing. In Sydney, my iPhone buzzed. It was my Air Quality Index app, still set to Beijing conditions. The message read, "Beyond Index, hazardous, stay indoors." High in her hermetically sealed apartment in Beijing, Chao-Fei imagined the end of the world. If an earthquake happened, she wondered, would the fire engines ever arrive? Would there be any help? Perhaps she should stock up on food, she thought. Beijing is now so spread out, the scale hardly feels human at all. In Chao-Fei's hometown, Guangzhou, she'd been used to hearing the sounds of life all around her in its narrow, crowded streets. The sizzle of cooking, the hammering of kitchen cleavers, the sounds of conversation. In Beijing, as she chopped vegetables for her family's dinner, she could hardly hear anyone else at all. Looking out over the city, it was as if someone had hit the mute button. The smog that hit Beijing in the winter of 2013 was just a darker, more dangerous version of the haze that can choke the city at any time of the year now. I was in Beijing in the northern autumn of that same year. Beijing's October skies were once the stuff of poetry, but every day I was there, the Air Quality Index app buzzed the bad news. At dinner parties, you got used to being handed a face mask at the end of the night to get you home safely, where once you might have hoped for a piece of cake and a party napkin. For Chao-Fei, the miasma embodied a kind of depression that she detected in the capital, a weariness, as if the density of the particles in the air were congesting people's spirits too. By the time she showed me her new film, Haze and Fog, I was thoroughly inside the mood that had inspired it. The film takes place in and around a gated apartment complex, the kind of place where the cosseted residents hardly interact with the outside world at all, or each other. A silent army of assistants cater to their needs. Couriers, maids, security guards, manicurists, and even dominatrixes arrive to service them in their homes. When the zombies appeared at the end, it was almost a relief, especially when I realized that the army of the undead included all the one-time support staff who had previously serviced their betters' privileged, isolated lives and were now chowing down on their remains. China has no tradition on zombie stories, but the AMC's The Walking Dead is a huge hit there. And some days it's hard not to agree with Taofei that zombies might be quite at home in the People's Republic now, as it struggles with pollution that makes many of its cities barely livable. Her film played on the feeling you often get in China that really anything might happen. In a country where so many extraordinary things have occurred in the past 4 decades, would zombies be such a surprise? A few months later, in the spring of 2014, I went to see Jia Eili's work in a new show in 798. On the vast canvases, lightning crackled across bleak alien vistas, and a small colony of humans eked out an existence in the sparse landscape. Some wore space helmets while they explored great craters in the ground. Others huddled for warmth outside a craft shaped like a diving bell. Another stood alone, his head flaming as if struck by lightning. The wasteland in Jia Eili's earlier works had become a blighted planet with few artifacts of human life. Like Taofei, he seemed to be haunted by a post-apocalyptic world. In the past decade, things had rapidly improved for the people in Jia Eili's hometown. In 2003, after years of layoffs and closures, the government had decided to reinvest in the northeast of China, building new modern factories and cleaner industries. His hometown of Dandong had become a major port, handling exports for the whole northeast, while Shenyang, where he had spent his college years, had been rebuilt as a green city. And yet, Jia Eili still felt a sense of loss. People haven't become happier just because they have become richer, he mused to me one day. Today, most people don't have belief or faith, and they can't find a direction in their life. There's a battle going on inside them between the spiritual and the material. Underlying all of this, he told me, was a wrenching sense of dislocation, because history had moved so fast. Dandong lies on the Yalu River, which forms the border with North Korea. He grew up playing on the banks of the river, where he could look across and see the people living on the other side. When he was a child, life on both sides of the river looked the same. Now, it was as if they were on separate planets. Last time I went home, he told me, I had this strange illusion. When I looked across the river, I felt like I was a young child again, because what I was seeing across the river was exactly what I had seen as a child. It was beautiful. But then if I looked behind me, all my memories of my life and my parents' life and my grandparents' life were gone. They had all been overtaken by these new tall buildings and had disappeared. You know, every Chinese person tries to find a secret spot, a place where they can go and feel connected to the past. For me, it's this riverbank. Nearly everyone has a secret path to take them back to the past. If they didn't, they'd go crazy. The speed of change would just be unbearable. When I first met Pei Li, I didn't imagine she thought much about the past, and yet, when she was offered her first solo show, she immediately chose to create a memorial to a China that was passing away. Pei Li had grown up under the tutelage of her grandfather. Disappointed that she wasn't a boy, he decided nonetheless to ensure that she had a classical education. At an early age, she was given lessons in calligraphy and learned all the major styles, and later went to music lessons. As she grew up, she watched her grandfather work on his beloved bonsai garden, making the constant, tiny refinements needed to achieve a perfect recreation of a classical mountains and streams landscape. Then one day, after 40 years of painstaking devotion to his garden, the old man suddenly abandoned it. He told me he was through with art, she told me. He said it was useless. He wanted to embrace the possibilities of the new China, she said. Suddenly he was busy making money and dating younger women. Pei Li watched as the bonsai trees withered away. Given a chance for a solo show in Beijing, she set off for her hometown to rescue what remained of her grandfather's garden. In the exhibition space, she recreated the old man's project to perfect scale. The dead miniature trees, precisely positioned in a pool of water darkened with black calligrapher's ink. Tiny speakers floated on its ebony surface, each giving off an occasional sad sound, like a foghorn at sea, which she created by slowing her favorite punk music track to a sonorous moan. Her work was a salute to a tradition whose very custodians had abandoned it. I think he really loved those bonsai, she told me later, but he didn't want to get left behind. The first half of the 2010s, found Zhang Shaogang once again delving into his past through his painting. His new work portrayed his parents as they were when he was young, and evoked the simple interiors of his childhood. In many of his canvases, a simple household appliance, an unshaded light bulb or bar radiator, was as prominent as the human figure in the frame, as if memory anchors itself firmly to a mute object as